June 3, 1942, 04 AM, the Pacific mid-ocean area. A low, monotonous thrum fills the cramped metal hull. The air inside the PBY Catalina is frigid, wet, and thick with the smell of engine oil and stale coffee. Visibility is zero. The twin Pratt & Whitney engines churn relentlessly, pulling the lumbering flying boat through an expanse of absolute darkness. Outside, the black ocean swells and breaks into phosphorescent foam just below the wings. The crew of a Navy patrol squadron PBY are ghosting across the black heart of the world, 500 miles west of Midway Atoll. Their mission is impossible: to find a massive enemy fleet hidden somewhere in 600,000 square miles of open sea. Lieutenant Jack Reed peers through the dew-streaked windscreen. His eyes burn from 14 hours of strained watching. They are the eyes of the entire United States Pacific Fleet. If they fail to find the Japanese carriers, the next sight will be the bombs falling on their own base. The dawn will reveal nothing but vast, empty water, unless the slow, vulnerable patrol plane stumbles across the greatest concentration of naval power ever assembled. The bombs that fell on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, did more than destroy battleships. They vaporized an entire naval doctrine. For decades, the world's navies had prepared for a decisive slugfest between massive, armored battle wagons. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood the new reality. His airstrike proved that the airplane carrier, not the battleship, was the new queen of the sea. The Japanese advance that followed was relentless, shocking the world with its speed and efficiency. Within 6 months, the Imperial Japanese forces had seized the Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma. They had created a vast defensive perimeter, an empire built on oil and conquest. The American forces were reeling. They held only Hawaii and a scattering of desperate island bases. The strategic heart of this war was now the aircraft carrier. The US Navy possessed only a handful of these crucial vessels in the Pacific: USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown. Their mission was simply survival. They conducted sporadic, morale-boosting raids, like the Doolittle raid, but the underlying military situation remained dire. The Japanese fleet, centered on its 6 superb fleet carriers, the Kido Butai, felt invincible. The first hint of a shift came in May 1942 at the Battle of the Coral Sea. It was the first naval battle in history where the opposing ships never saw one another, fighting entirely via their aircraft. Strategically, it halted the Japanese advance toward Port Moresby. Tactically, it was a bloody draw, but it took the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku out of action temporarily. Crucially, it bought the Americans time. Admiral Yamamoto knew that the window for decisive victory was closing. American industry was a terrifying engine of production, already beginning to replace the ships lost at Pearl Harbor. He required one final, massive stroke to crush the remaining US fleet and force a negotiated peace. That stroke would land on the strategically isolated Midway Atoll. Midway was a vital staging post and a potential forward base for B-17 bombers. If it fell, the Japanese could harass Hawaii itself. Yamamoto's objective was twofold: capture the island and, more importantly, draw the entire precious American carrier fleet into a trap where his superior numbers and skill could annihilate them. The stage was set for a massive climactic showdown, but the Americans were still largely blind to the specific details of the coming attack. That blindness needed to be fixed, and the solution lay not in the fastest, newest technology, but in the slow, high-flying eyes of the US Navy's patrol squadrons. Yamamoto's objective was not simply to seize the remote island of Midway. It was to lure the remnants of the US Pacific Fleet to their doom. His master plan was a complex, overwhelming display of force, involving 4 separate fleets: the Invasion Transport Group, the Battleship Support Group, the Screening Force, and, most crucially, the First Air Fleet, or Kido Butai, led by the brilliant but uncompromising Vice Admiral Nagumo. This air fleet contained the 4 heavy carriers that had devastated Pearl Harbor: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The Japanese believed their target, which they cryptically labeled AF in their communications, remained a secret. This was their critical error. Unknown to them, a small, highly secretive unit stationed in Hawaii, Station Hypo, had cracked major elements of the Japanese naval code, JN-25B. The US intelligence specialists, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, understood that AF almost certainly referred to Midway. To confirm this theory and overcome doubts from Washington, Rochefort orchestrated a brilliant deception. Midway's defenders were instructed to send an uncoded message stating their freshwater purification system had broken down. Days later, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese message confirming AF is short of water. The intelligence coup allowed the US commanders, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz at Pearl Harbor, to deploy his meager forces in a revolutionary manner. Instead of defending Midway, Nimitz positioned his 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, in an ambush position northeast of the atoll, out of range of Japanese scouting patrols, but within striking distance of the invasion fleet. The critical variable in this high-stakes gamble was time and location. The vastness of the Central Pacific meant that the Japanese fleet, once it entered the area, would still be needle in a haystack. The US carriers could not launch a crippling attack until they knew the precise location, heading, and composition of Nagumo's Kido Butai. Conversely, if the Japanese scouts found the US carriers first, the battle would be lost before it began. The entire fate of the Pacific War now hinged on the narrow window between the Japanese launching their strike and their position being confirmed. This crucial mission was entrusted not to the fast modern destroyers or carrier planes, but to the slow, antiquated PBY Catalina flying boats. These lumbering aircraft, operating from the Midway base itself, were the only vessels with the range and endurance to cover the immense area and provide the forward scouting perimeter. They were the eyes of the fleet, flying alone into the immense vacuum of the ocean, searching for a single, deadly sign of the enemy. The consolidated PBY Catalina was an anachronism even when the war began. It was a flying boat, designed in the 1930s, defined by its massive parasol wing mounted high above the hull, giving it a distinct, almost insect-like silhouette. This design was not built for combat speed, but for endurance and range. The plane's maximum speed barely crested 125 miles per hour, lower than some fighters of the previous war. Japanese pilots often mocked it, calling it a Dumbo or a flying oil can. Yet, the PBY possessed 2 features that made it indispensable for the Midway operation: its incredible operational range of over 4,000 miles, and its ability to land on the open sea to refuel or pick up survivors. Its slow speed, counterintuitively, made it an excellent reconnaissance platform. The stable, low-revving engines and high wing position offered the crew a silent, expansive view of the water below, ideal for spotting the thin wake of a destroyer or the black smudge of a distant fleet. The trade-off was stark. The plane was an easy target, relying purely on its immense operating distance to stay out of enemy range, and the hope that its sighting would be confirmed before the inevitable interception by much faster enemy fighters. The mission of the PBY crew was a brutal test of human limits. These were not the glorious, fast-moving fighter pilots, but the Navy's reconnaissance men, often spending 12 to 18 hours in the air, crammed into the cold, vibrating hull. The aircraft was barely heated, and the noise from the engines was deafening, forcing communication through shouted words and hand signals. The crew worked in shifts, meticulously sweeping their assigned 10-degree sector, a wedge of the Pacific that extended up to 700 miles from Midway. Exhaustion was their constant enemy. Staring down at the endless, undulating blue for hours on end induced a hypnotic fatigue, often leading to phantom sightings. The life of a PBY scout was not one of dogfights, but of lonely, meticulous hunting, with the constant, grinding knowledge that if they spotted the enemy, they would be sacrificing their own element of surprise. They were the ultimate first line of defense, knowing that if the battle came to them, they had already failed. For the elite aviators of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the PBY Catalina represented the softer, weaker side of the American war machine. Their carrier fighters, the nimble Mitsubishi A6M-0, could reach speeds of over 300 miles per hour, making the PBY an almost stationary target. When a patrol plane was spotted, the Japanese pilots treated it as target practice. This contempt, however, masked a tactical vulnerability. The Japanese reliance on their primary carrier-based scouts, which had far less range and endurance than the PBY, created a critical gap in their forward screen. Admiral Nagumo's Kido Butai was powerful, but it was also strategically blind beyond a few hundred miles. They expected to find Midway first, destroy its air power, and only then encounter the US carriers. The possibility that the slow American flying boats could be patrolling hundreds of miles farther out, sacrificing themselves to provide critical warning, was an operational factor they dismissed. They laughed at the PBY's slowness, failing to recognize that speed was irrelevant when the object was not to fight, but merely to see. The success of the PBY reconnaissance mission depended entirely on the meticulous, repetitive execution of an almost impossible task, covering a vast oceanic arc. The search plan, flown out of Midway, was based on rigid 10-degree sectors. Each sector, like a massive slice of pie, extended up to 700 nautical miles from the atoll. The PBYs took off well before dawn, flew at low altitude for optimal spotting, and were instructed to maintain radio silence unless they achieved a positive sighting. The mathematics of the search were daunting. Even with the dozen or so PBYs available, there were still enormous gaps in coverage, spaces large enough for an entire carrier fleet to slip through undetected. The patrols were flying at the absolute limit of their range, and any significant deviation for weather or evasion meant leaving an unsearched corridor that could spell disaster. This was not a sophisticated tactical maneuver. It was a desperate, geometric sweep of the ocean, relying on the sheer will of the crews to fly straight and true, and a considerable amount of pure luck for the Japanese fleet to appear in their narrow, pre-assigned window. The US commitment to Midway was a monumental strategic risk taken by Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. His decision to position the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown hundreds of miles northeast of Midway was based almost entirely on the faith he placed in the codebreakers of Station Hypo. It was a calculated ambush, but an ambush requires perfect intelligence. Nimitz knew that if the Japanese struck first, or if the PBYs failed to confirm the enemy's exact position, his carriers, the last operational capital ships in the Pacific, would be exposed and destroyed. Nimitz's gamble hinged on the ability of the PBY crews to overcome the inherent challenges of their mission. He was betting the fate of the war not on new technology or overwhelming force, but on the endurance of obsolete aircraft and the accuracy of exhausted spotters. The commanders of the carrier task forces, Admirals Spruance and Fletcher, remained in an agonizing holding pattern, unable to commit their forces until the PBYs delivered the message that would unlock the battle. For the men flying those silent, slow sectors, the mission carried a crushing moral weight. They were the final filter for the most critical piece of information in the Pacific War. Their sighting would not only trigger the US counterattack, but would also likely summon the wrath of the entire Japanese carrier air wing directly onto their own location. They were flying into a potential maelstrom with a high probability of not returning. The PBY crews carried a payload of 4 500-pound depth charges, or bombs, but their true weapon was their ability to transmit a coherent message. If they found the Kido Butai, their primary task was to survive long enough to radio the precise location, heading, and composition of the force. The knowledge that they were the eyes of the fleet and that their personal survival was secondary to the transmission of that signal defined their lonely journey. This immense psychological pressure intensified as the pre-dawn hours of June 4th approached, marking the narrow operational window where the Japanese were predicted to arrive. The immense Pacific Ocean was finally yielding its secrets, and the slow, lumbering patrols were about to find the fastest, deadliest naval weapon on Earth. The darkness of June 3rd, 1942, was heavy with the expectation of violence. The PBY crews from Midway flew their patrols, the hours a monotonous blur of engine noise and ocean swells. Around 09 AM, the first critical sighting was made. PBY 5A number 11, piloted by Lieutenant Jack G. Reed of VP-24, broke radio silence. Reed had spotted not the carrier force, but the enormous, separate Japanese main transport group, the slow-moving freighters and escorts carrying the troops intended to occupy Midway. The message transmitted back to Midway was terse. 11 ships bearing 262, distance 700 miles. This confirmed the general location of the invasion and triggered the first, desperate American response. In a preemptive strike, 9 lumbering B-17 flying fortresses were launched from Midway, followed by 4 PBYs carrying torpedoes, the Black Cat Squadron. The attacks, conducted in fading light, did little damage to the well-escorted transport group, but they underscored the enemy's undeniable presence. The massive armada was closing. The true threat, however, remained hidden. Where were the 4 fast carriers of the Kido Butai? Dawn, June 4, 1942. This was the designated window for the Japanese attack. The PBYs were launched again into the vast western sectors. This was the most critical patrol of the Pacific War. The crews knew the Japanese carrier planes would be airborne soon, searching for them. At 04:30 AM, the first Japanese planes roared toward Midway, beginning their bombing run. Admiral Spruance and Fletcher, positioned hundreds of miles away, held their breath, waiting. They knew where the bombs were falling, but they did not know the launch point. To commit their precious carrier planes on a guess was suicide. They needed confirmation of the Japanese carrier position, a precise course, speed, and location before they could launch the strike that would decide the war. The PBYs flew toward the sounds of battle, pressing deeper into the known danger zone. Every minute that passed without a sighting was a minute the Japanese carriers were closing the distance, and a minute the American fleet remained exposed. The tension in the air was unbearable, transmitted through the silent, frantic waiting on the decks of the Enterprise and Yorktown. The fate of the entire American effort rested on a single radio message that had not yet been sent. At 05:34 AM, June 4, 1942, the silence was shattered. Flying Sector 205, approximately 175 miles northwest of Midway, was PBY 5A number 8 of Patrol Squadron 44, VP-44. The plane was crewed by Pilot Lieutenant Howard Adey and co-pilot Ensign Jack R. Amery, with Ensign Amery on the search controls. Through a break in the morning overcast, Amery spotted them. Not just ships, but the distinctive, immense shape of a carrier deck. It was the Kido Butai. Amery's voice, tight with adrenaline and disbelief, radioed the sighting to his exhausted radio man, who immediately began transmitting the most important message of the battle. The first vital alert was garbled, but the second, precise transmission cut through the static. Enemy carriers, 2 sections, position 30 degrees, 40 minutes north, 179 degrees, 30 minutes west, course 090, speed 20 knots. Within minutes of sending the first message, the lumbering PBY was spotted by a Japanese patrol, which vectored in the ship's Zero fighter cover. The contempt the Japanese felt for the slow-flying boat was instantly translated into furious action. Zeros swarmed the PBY, their cannons and machine guns ripping into the unarmoured hull. Amory and his crew fought back desperately with their limited .50 caliber machine guns, the plane shuddering under the impact. The focus was not on fighting the Zeros, but on staying airborne just long enough to ensure the message was relayed completely. Meanwhile, on the decks of the Japanese carriers, the crews were refueling and rearming their planes from the successful strike on Midway. The spotters and gunners, seeing the Dumbo plane that had dared to find them, opened fire. They watched the slow-moving target with a sense of superiority, not realizing that the PBY had just delivered the Kido Butai's exact location to the waiting American fleet. The Japanese gunners may have laughed at its lack of speed, but the PBY's message was already on its way to the USS Enterprise. The discovery was a decisive breakthrough. The message reached Admiral Raymond Spruance, who had assumed command of Task Force 16. Spruance now had the one element Yamamoto had been so careful to deny him: a precise fix. He ignored naval doctrine, which suggested a cautious approach, and ordered an immediate full-scale strike launch. This audacious decision to commit all available aircraft, even before the PBY confirmed the number of carriers, was the pivot point. The PBY had provided the knowledge, Spruance provided the will. The moment of contact was the turning point of the Battle of Midway. The slow, disposable PBY had found the fast, lethal heart of the Japanese fleet, ensuring that when the American carrier planes arrived, they would find the Japanese decks clogged with armed, fueled, and vulnerable aircraft. The unheralded reconnaissance flight had fundamentally shifted the tactical advantage, moving the balance of the Pacific War in a single, desperate radio transmission. The PBY's sighting at 05:34 am, June 4th, unleashed the full fury of the US carrier fleet. The intelligence delivered by Ensign Amory and his crew allowed Admiral Spruance to launch his dive bombers and torpedo planes on a precise, unpredicted course. Within hours, the Japanese Kido Butai Corps of their naval air power was crippled. In a series of devastating, coordinated attacks, the carriers Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu were hit and set ablaze. Later that afternoon, the last carrier, Hiryu, which had managed a brief, successful counterattack against the USS Yorktown, was also found and destroyed. The results were catastrophic for Japan. In a single day, they lost 4 heavy fleet carriers, over 250 highly trained aircraft, and the vast majority of their most experienced and irreplaceable carrier pilots. The strategic value of this victory was incalculable. It was the first decisive Allied victory against Japan, and permanently halted the enemy's expansionist drive in the Pacific. The initiative shifted from Tokyo to Washington. The US was now able to transition from a strategy of desperate defense to one of offensive island hopping. The consequences were immediate and psychological. For the Americans, the victory was a powerful restoration of confidence after the trauma of Pearl Harbor. For the Japanese High Command, the shock was immense. The true extent of the losses was deliberately concealed from the Japanese public and most of the Navy, a necessary deception to prevent national morale from collapsing. The loss was not merely ships. It was the loss of the trained human capital required to operate a complex carrier fleet. The PBYs, though slow and dismissed, continued their essential work in the following days. Their enduring presence on the scouting line aided in the tracking of the retiring Japanese forces and played a crucial role in the subsequent sinking of the heavy cruiser Mikuma on June 6th. Their long range also made them vital assets in search and rescue operations, often plucking downed American airmen from the open sea after the carrier strikes concluded. The reports filtering back to Pearl Harbor emphasized the crucial nature of the reconnaissance flights. Admiral Nimitz later affirmed the importance of the reconnaissance teams, effectively stating that the battle was won not by the fighters, but by the eyes that found the enemy. The most effective weapons in the battle were not the torpedoes or bombs, but the single, clear radio message transmitted from a vulnerable flying boat. The Battle of Midway profoundly changed the strategic doctrine of naval warfare. The most significant shift was the irrefutable confirmation that air reconnaissance was no longer a supporting function, but the decisive, primary element of any naval operation. The PBY Catalina, often considered a secondary legacy aircraft, had proven that range and endurance were superior to speed when it came to strategic scouting. The plane could fly beyond the reach of the enemy's main air groups and remain on station for hours, making it the perfect vehicle for gathering the intelligence that broke the Japanese ambush. This lesson was quickly incorporated into Allied doctrine. The need for long-range, over-the-horizon eyes became paramount. The slow but reliable nature of the PBY was quickly utilized across the Pacific and Atlantic, not just for scouting, but for anti-submarine warfare and the famous Dumbo rescue missions. Its ability to loiter and land on heavy seas saved thousands of lives and gave airmen the confidence to push their own aircraft to the limits, knowing there was an eye and a potential lifeboat far out at sea. The broader consequence of the PBY's success at Midway underscored the power of information warfare. Admiral Nimitz's willingness to trust the unseen work of Commander Rochefort's codebreakers and the lonely vigilance of the reconnaissance crews proved that intelligence could be a more lethal weapon than guns or armor. The American victory was a fusion of technological intelligence, forward scouting, the PBY, and audacious leadership, spruance, all working in concert. The Japanese, conversely, had underestimated all three elements. They possessed superior pilot skill at the time, but they lacked the essential long-range vision necessary to prevent themselves from being ambushed. The legacy of the PBY at Midway is the realization that the largest battles often hinge on the smallest, most unheralded actions. The plane, ridiculed by its enemies and often unappreciated by its own fleet, demonstrated that range and endurance trumped speed for strategic scouting. It proved that every component of the military machine, from the advanced code-breaking stations to the slowest flying boat, contributes to the final outcome. The slow, lumbering PBY did not sink a single carrier with its meager armament, but by providing the critical 6 hours of warning, it set the conditions for the most important naval victory of the war. The silent return of the reconnaissance crews, their unheralded mission complete, marked the end of the beginning of the Pacific War, paving the way for the long, hard journey to Tokyo. The Battle of Midway, cemented by the slow, determined flight of the PBY Catalina, reveals a fundamental truth about warfare. The fastest sword is useless without the eye to guide it. The entire massive structure of Admiral Yamamoto's plan, his superior fleet, his experienced pilots, his strategic surprise, was rendered null by the single clear signal transmitted from an aircraft barely faster than a delivery truck. The PBY's story is a testament to the fact that in war, the greatest vulnerability often lies not in technology, but in information blindness. The Japanese laughed at the slow flying boat, valuing pure speed and firepower over the patient, grinding necessity of long-range reconnaissance. They failed to account for the single, most crucial advantage the PBY offered: endurance and position. It could be in the right place at the right time when the more sophisticated aircraft had long since turned back. This event reveals that heroism is not limited to the daring fighter pilot. It is found in the lonely vigilance of the scout. The exhausted, freezing men of the PBY crews, flying silent patrols for hours, embodied the quiet, grinding persistence required for victory. They accepted that their sighting would make them a target, yet they pressed on, understanding that their survival was secondary to the transmission of the message. Midway was ultimately a battle won by intelligence, range, and resolve. The PBY Catalina stands as a powerful symbol of this reality, demonstrating that the future of naval conflict rests not on the size of the armament, but on the certainty of the unseen information. The slow, lumbering flying boat, derided by the enemy, proved to be the most critical piece of air power in the turning point of the Pacific War. It did not fire the killing shot, but it drew the map to victory.